So, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event entitled Strategic Realignments in the Middle East Ahead of a Biden Presidency, a View from Jerusalem. I'm GUDRUN. I'm the director of the Austrian Study Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution in Stadtschleining, and also together with Wilfried Graf, the founder of the Herbert C. Kellman Institute for Interactive Conflict Resolution. So this is why I have the honor to welcome you today. This is a joint event of these three organizations, the ASPR, the HKI, and the International Institute for Peace. This is actually already our second online event that we are co-hosting on the topic of Israel-Palestine and the Middle East. And this is actually part of a broader cooperation between these three institutions that we have pursued over the last years, and which actually started with a joint study trip exactly 2 years ago to Israel and Palestine. I would like to thank Hannes Swoboda, president of the IIP, and also Stephanie FENKART, director of the IIP, for this cooperation. It is always a pleasure to cooperate with you, and I hope that we will be able to gather to also organize soon again on-site events and not only online events. There are a lot of online events, we know this. So we are very grateful that you take the time and that you have the interest in also joining us today in this session. I'm actually very confident that we will have a very interesting hour together, because on one hand, the new Biden administration definitely will change US strategies with regard to Israel-Palestine, with regard to the broader Middle East. So we will have a lot to discuss and reflect. And on the other hand, because I also have been knowing our speaker, OFER ZALZBERG, for the last 15 years, and I know that his analysis is always very in-depth and also very thought-provoking. So I'm very much looking forward to this, and I would like to hand over to my colleague Stephanie, who will actually moderate this session.
Thank you very much, Gudrun, and thank you very much also for the cooperation, which you mentioned is already long-standing, and I look forward to the discussion. And I also hope that we can have events in the future where we can meet personally, which we already did, by the way, I think 1.5 years ago, together with OFER. I would suggest, just for the procedure, for all the participants, if you have questions, please feel free. I really encourage you to use the Q&A function below. Ask the questions, I will go through them during the discussion, and very sure that OFER will try to give you the best answers he's able to give, and to give us a foresight on what is going on in Israel, but also in the region, especially in light of the Biden administration. Let me now come to our special guest from Jerusalem, OFER ZALZBERG. I'm very happy to see you again. OFER ZALZBERG is the Middle East Program Director at the Herbert C. Kellman Institute, which is also one of our cooperation partners today. And before, he used to be Senior Analyst at the International Crisis Group on the Middle Eastern Program. Maybe, OFER, just to kick off the discussion, you can very shortly present yourself on what you have been doing recently, what are your areas of research, and just very shortly, and then I will take over, and then we go more into the content discussion. And thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me for all three organizations, and it's really a pleasure. Thank you everyone for attending. We have now been working in the Middle East program on something we call conflict transformation across worldviews. And we are doing it in a few contexts across the region, especially Israeli-Palestinian. And it's basically a challenge. How can you allow conflict parties that have very different worldviews, different values, different sets of laws they are committed to, reach understandings despite these differences? And we've been doing this in crisis situations and in terms of more ambitious peacemaking, how to reach agreements. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, OFER. today, I mean, Gudrun already mentioned the Biden administration. I think we will talk especially also about the so-called Abraham Accords, what they mean for the region, what will they mean for Israel. We will talk a little bit about regional actors, also those who probably didn't sign those accords. We will talk about what the Biden administration means specifically for Israel, but then, of course, also touch upon, at least this is what we're going to try if we have time, also on domestic issues. We know there is a health crisis, there's a political crisis as well in Israel. It's the fourth election within 2 years in March this year. But before we start, I would suggest maybe that, OFER, you can maybe to give us a little bit of context to sketch on how the different Middle Eastern camps are realigning in the context of Biden's election. I mean, we heard of the possibility of the US returning to the JCPOA, the so-called Iran nuclear deal. We also know that the US, who always was the biggest and strongest ally of Israel, is also turning a little bit more than to China and also has different aspects to struggle with the next year. So maybe you can just in 10, 15 minutes, wrap up a little bit the context before we go more into detail. And again, to all the participants, feel free to ask questions already during the discussion. I will go through it. And Gudrun, for you as well, if you want to have a follow-up, please hop in and ask on and follow up and give your views as well. But OFER, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, you know, there are always strategic realignments. Whenever there is a change of administration in the US, there are strategic realignments in the Middle East. Even as the world is shifting from a unipolar to a multipolar international system, the US remains the most significant global superpower, at least with respect to the Middle East. And this is only truer when the US is shifting from President Trump, who had a very distinct, unconventional character and policies, to President Biden's more conventional ways. And this shift overall is likely to introduce more predictability, for better and worse. It's impossible to sketch everything that is happening, so I'll be really in broad strokes. I'll look at the four main camps in the region and what each of them is doing. And with your permission, I'd like to start with Iran and its allies. And Iran and its allies are basically preparing, as Stephanie already mentioned, for a Biden policy which aims to restore the JCPOA, but also to add to it different curbs on Iran's long-range missile program, regional support for proxies, which act against US allies in the Gulf and against Israel. And there remain all kinds of unanswered questions regarding the sequencing of who goes first between the US and Iran in terms of resuming compliance with the JCPOA. And it is also unclear what and how exactly Biden will seek to achieve regarding Iran's regional activities. But Iran, the most important realignment that we are seeing from Tehran is that Tehran is preparing for de-escalatory processes vis-a-vis Gulf countries. This includes preparing for different kinds of maritime coordination in the Persian Gulf, thinking how it can contribute to mitigating or ending the war in Yemen. We've seen now a meeting with the UN envoy. So we are seeing them shifting to a new reality, things we have not seen for 4 years. And in addition to this, Iranian elections themselves, which are planned for June, are influenced by the new American context, not only in terms of whether and how to engage diplomatically with the US, but also in terms of which coalition within Iran will be able to demonstrate that it secured sanction removal. The same coalition will need to absorb, of course, criticism for any concessions this will require. What we see in terms of preparations is hopes in Iran that there will be a crisis in Israel-US relations after supposedly very cooperative relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, and that this crisis will actually mean the US will act without deep consultations with Israel. So the US will be free, if you wish, of Israeli constraints. And in Israel, I can tell you that there are hopes that Iranian elections will actually harden Tehran's position to the extent that it will not be able to resume full compliance, that the gap between the Tehran and the US will be very big. I'm putting it on the table because as the parties are all realigning, this makes, if you look at it from the perspective of durable solutions, finding a durable solution to the nuclear question in Iran, the risk of resuming compliance of the JCPOA without the Republicans in the US, without Israel and the Republicans in the US, without Saudi Arabia perhaps, can be very dire. We can have another president in 4 years that takes a different position. Iran's allies, I'll say just a word about, especially in the Levant, about Assad in Damascus and Hezbollah in Lebanon. there is a focus on whether the US would persist in its policy of maximal sanctions towards Syria and regarding Hezbollah. In Damascus, there is an interest in using the opportunity presented by the Biden administration to end a veto of the Trump administration on Gulf countries entering the Syrian market, investing more in Syria, normalizing diplomatic relations with Syria, and projecting soft power in Syria. This is something that Trump prevented, saying that as long as Syria is so allied with Iran, the US would not permit its allies to do so. And Syria is hoping for a change. Syria is hoping that Biden will be what it will view as more pragmatic, and basically have Syria return to the Arab League rather than veto it. Have Syria resume relations with the Gulf. And the reason behind all of this is that if Gulf money goes into Syria, Assad's dependence on Iran is decreased. He will not have almost only Iran and Russia as sources of support. This also includes whether Syria will have access to its oil fields within the country. Trump purposefully prevented that. Will Biden change that? There are additional things, I won't get to it, but that's very broadly the first camp. So for Iran, it's really the nuclear file, regional activities, and sanctions for the allies. Second camp is Turkey and some of its allies, which are closer to the Muslim Brotherhood. And whereas Biden is intent on improving relations with Iran, his administration's approach towards Turkey is highly critical. Turkish purchases of the Russian S-400s is a major issue. US support for the Kurds is a big problem for Turkey, of course. And the US refusal to extradite Fethullah Gulen. These are big issues that color the relationship, in addition to an increasingly authoritarian conduct in Turkey with respect to democracy, human rights, issues that President Trump was willing to disregard in effect, and President Biden is not willing to tolerate. He's probably the most pro-Kurdish president coming into the White House. So we will see. And what we are already seeing at the same time, just to say the basics, for the US, Turkey is very important. It is a very significant NATO member, the second largest army. It is very close to Europe and can affect its interests, something that is important for Biden. So it's not as if Biden just wants to go to an all-out clash with Turkey. And what we are seeing already is Erdogan is also realigning. He's making some very significant signals, at least, some very significant symbolic gestures. He commenced Greek-Turkish exploration talks regarding the maritime questions. We are seeing him coming publicly in favor of the two-state solution for Cyprus. And we are seeing him working to restore the relationship with Israel. In all kinds of things, having nominated again an ambassador to Israel, renewing direct Israeli flights to Turkey after a decade. So we are seeing him basically fearing that there will be American pressures on Turkey regarding reform within Turkey, and that this will mean an end to his rule because the opposition will be freer to act. And he's trying to appease the US on other regional fights. The third camp is mostly in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and its allies, but also, let's say, Egypt and a few other countries. And they anticipate a significant clash with the democratic administration over human rights violations, democratic norms. For Saudi Arabia, this is primarily about, of course, the severe human rights violations in Yemen, the assassination of Khashoggi, a journalist, the question of human rights domestically in Saudi Arabia, and so on. President Biden used very strong language against the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, during the campaign. So this is also has a personal dimension because of the supposed involvement of the Crown Prince in the Khashoggi killing. And what we have already seen is quite significant. We saw Saudi Arabia realigning by ending the boycott on Qatar in order for this not to be on the table when they first meet Biden. Much more than because Kushner came at the end of the fourth year, and a lot of the media gave the credit to this mediation. And we also saw them signaling through the Arab League, Saudi Arabia and its allies, a return to the traditional positions regarding the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something that they feel will be more viewed favorably in a Biden administration. We are seeing the UAE taking more distance from Yemen in terms of direct military involvement. And of course, we saw the UAE realigning, as Stephanie mentioned, in a very significant way, launching the Abraham Accords with Israel, doing it in order to make sure that if a democratic administration comes to power, It is viewed as a major ally of Israel, and therefore can enjoy this kind of support of pro-Israeli voices in the US, which are very numerous. Egypt too has been increasing its visible involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, both in terms of convening Palestinian factions as they prepare for elections, and engaging with the Munich group, France, Germany, and Jordan regarding this. Finally, I'll conclude. Is Israel, if there is a fourth camp, I'm not sure if one country justifies that, but we see a split in the dynamics within Israel in the run-up to the Israeli elections that are scheduled for the month of March. And the main thing that is relevant for this talk is how actually the adversaries of Netanyahu, Gideon Sa'ar, Naftali Bennett coming from right-wing parties, Yair Lapid coming from a centrist party, are criticizing Netanyahu for having mismanaged the relationship with the US, lost in effect bipartisan support for Israel, and all of them claiming that they will know how to do that better. And this creates an interesting opportunity for Biden to cooperate with significant forces on the Israeli right, which is interesting. Netanyahu is still mulling over whether to clash with Biden publicly, also for electoral gain, meaning to tell Israelis, I'm the only Israeli leader who would know how to withstand US pressures, or to seek a more cooperative stance in order to influence US policies, especially regarding Iran. So how is Israel realigning? One is, I told you, in elections, and there are 3 quick points with respect to the Iran Gulf de-escalation that I had mentioned, okay? Israel basically, if Israel will be excluded from regional de-escalation, Israel may try to shoot it down, okay? Because Israel will fear that it will be alone against Iran if the Gulf becomes, enters a certain kind of detente with Iran. This is one thing that Israel is studying closely now. The second thing is regarding the Gulf camp. Israel, regarding the Gulf camp, is keen to have Biden broker a new Abrahamic Accord, this time primarily with Saudi Arabia. Many accords, but the biggest thing is Saudi Arabia. This will probably require a major policy shift from Israel regarding the Palestinians, one which a right-leaning government in Israel will not find obvious. And finally, we are seeing that Israel is trying to, it sees that Turkey, Erdogan are interested in repairing the relationship with Israel, and Israel doesn't feel that it is in a rush to do so. It is not that today, if you show that you have good relationships with Turkey, you win points in Washington or something of the sort. And Israel is basically thinking all kinds of conditions, all kinds of costs it could demand from Erdogan in order to repair the relationship. The most significant one for the continuation of our chat today is for Erdogan to remove Hamas's leadership from Turkey. This is quite complicated because some of the Hamas leaders got there as part of the Shalit deal, a prisoner deal in which Israel allowed Palestinian prisoners to leave the country, including to Turkey. But most significantly, in the past, when Israel was on good terms with Turkey, actually Turkey knew how to use its leverage with Hamas also for the benefit of Israel. If Hamas will leave Turkey, it will probably go to places that are even less friendly to Israel, Beirut or Tehran or whatever it is. So this very broadly is where we are, meaning we have 4 camps. All of them are saying, who is this new guy coming to Washington? And they are all trying to guess what he will do. And they are already preparing for the first calls. So far, he was very busy with bigger things, both domestic and in the Far East. And very soon he will get to the Middle East. So I think the timing of this conversation is very good.
Thank you very much, OFER, for giving us this very important context and also including Turkey, because this is often very much, I would say, not so much considered when we speak about the region. Since you mentioned the Abraham Accords, I think we showed a little bit stick to the Abraham Accords. Maybe the Abraham Accords have been mentioned as historic, more or less historic in the sense of normalization between Arab and Arab states and Israel. So Israel now is more or less part of the community of nations in the Arab world, and this is also interesting, taking into account that there already have been relations before. I mean, probably a little bit more quiet, but maybe can you reflect a little bit? Well, like, what are these Abraham Accords? I mean, we know they are the so-called peace treaties with Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco and Sudan. But what do they really entail? And do you really think they have this transformative power, also in the sense of really like reshifting the balance in the region? Please.
Great, very important. So I do think that the Abraham Accords are historic, even though I think that their impact was overstated, both by the Trump administration and the Israeli government. I think they are historic, first in terms of how they reflect the situation in the Arab world today, in 2020, 2021. And really, we are seeing that a decade after the Arab uprisings, we are seeing that Arab governments have changed considerably, both in terms of maintaining control over their own societies and in terms of surmounting great domestic economic crises, including sometimes full-out wars, Yemen, Libya, and so on. And in this context, when the Arab Middle East is torn apart, we are seeing that some Arab countries, unlike in the past, the logic that stood the test for decades has changed. Because for some of these countries, the priorities have changed. The Palestinian issue has become a lower priority. And they feel they need to be much more self-centered. I think that this departure isn't comprehensive. I mean, we are talking about 4 countries out of 22 Arab countries, 2 already made peace with Israel previously, Jordan and Egypt. And the remaining ones are not doing it. And the countries that have normalized are mostly looking at it from Jerusalem, looking at it from the Levant, are coming from the Arab periphery. If it is the Gulf in the east, Sudan in the south, Morocco in the west, it's not the core. And it is also far from popular with the Arab publics, quite the contrary. I mean, when the Israeli government is doing polls of Arab public opinion, 90 to 95% are not viewing this favorably in most societies. Having said this, the UAE is the exception that demonstrates the rule. I mean, you know, in the Arab uprising, there was no uprising in the UAE. The society is very much in line with the government and so on. But even in the countries where it happened, we are seeing that it's not favorable. I wouldn't be surprised if we'll see even more Shia opposition in Bahrain to the government because of this. In Sudan, we saw the military government supporting the agreement, but not the civil one. In Morocco, we saw the king felt he needs to say that he's only restoring something that already existed rather than doing something new. Why is it nevertheless historic? For 2 reasons. One is the break from the logic of the Arab Peace Initiative, and especially in the case of Bahrain and the UAE, by saying we're doing full normalization. Even with Egypt and Jordan, Israel does not have full normalization. We will see whether Israel and the UAE and Bahrain will indeed get to full normalization. We haven't seen Mohammed bin Zayed coming to Israel yet. We will see. But this has been the commitment. And second, where I think has been missed, these agreements are historic because they make a direct reference to tradition, to Christian, Jewish, Muslim traditions, to the Abrahamic traditions. And it's very interesting. They do it in an international agreement based on international law. In the middle of it, you start to read sentences coming from a Bible, from something else. And it resonates with very different constituencies. The religious constituencies in particular are checking it in a totally different way. I think that the way in which it was received on the Israeli right, therefore, is particularly favorable and has been a success. And I think that on the Arab side, as I had mentioned, it was viewed often in the opposite way, as if this was cynical use of very important religious symbols to justify something that should not be justified. But I think that because of these 2 reasons, they are transformative, both in what has happened so far and in their potential for the future. The main question will be whether it will remain a set of separate bilateral agreements, or whether the normalizing countries and Israel will start to act together on regional issues. Whether this will become also what some countries fear it to be, some countries want it to be, a kind of a basis for a regional architecture, regional cooperation, maybe a regional security architecture and so on. And this is premature to say.
Thank you very much also for clarification in this. You mentioned that especially what is historic, that it is a breakaway of the Arab Peace Initiative from 2002, because as you said, the Palestinian question does not really seem to be quite high on the agenda these days when it comes to this full normalization, which you said is different because it is it is intended to get into this full normalization state once. You also mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I think it is also very important to see like what impact can those Abraham Accords have like for the regional actors. And we also already talked a little bit about Iran, but of course, I mean, they also, I guess, look at the Abraham Accords from a different point of view. And Lebanon, you mentioned. What about Syria and also Russia, since Russia is also an actor, especially in Syria and also in the region. So how could those Abraham Accords impact in the longer term, like all the regional actors? What is your stance and what your guess in this?
Great. So indeed, we are basically analyzing today two major realignments in the region. One is in relation to the new US administration, and the other one is in relation to the Abraham Accords and the momentum they've arguably created. I think that first the Saudi Arabia gave a certain kind of green light to the agreements that already happened. Certainly Bahrain would not have signed with Israel otherwise. It seems that there is a difference between the father, the king, and the crown prince, and the father who is more committed to the Arab Peace Initiative logic. And I think that with Biden, this logic will somewhat unravels less at the very least. But the Saudis they have a much more complicated society. Many traditional sources, many, the clerics are very powerful. There are already dramatic changes the crown prince is advancing. To add to this normalization with Israel it can be very difficult politically and societally. So Israel will need to, in order to do that, it will need to do something big that will justify that from a perspective of Arab public opinion. And I purposely say Arab and not only Saudi public opinion, because Saudis, they would like to continue to have a prominent role among all Arabs. And this is going to be very difficult. And there are two basic tracks here, I'll just say. One is to do something like what the UAE has done, which is one big agreement from the outset. The other thing is something more similar to what we have seen with the Sudan and Morocco, which is a gradual normalization, open-ended, starting with smaller steps, and saying maybe we will do more depending on how things go. And I don't rule out the second with Saudi Arabia. I think even then they will demand significant moves from Israel, but I think this is possible in the next 4 years. I don't think the first one is likely as long as the king is in power. Because the Saudis can enjoy, if you wish, this Israeli, Emirati, Bahraini, Moroccan alliance from afar. They don't necessarily immediately need to be part of it. In Iran, there is an inverse dynamic. In Iran, there is a concern that the Abraham Accords, in effect, are an attempt to surround and encircle Iran, that the enemies of Iran are allying up, that there is a tightening of the relationships within the camp of the adversaries, from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean through Israel. It's as if there is a wall. By the way, from Turkey, it looks as if this wall or a new alliance goes from the UAE all the way to Greece and Cyprus. And I think that here, again, the question is whether the normalization will remain just a set of bilateral relationships or more than that. From the perspective of Iran, a big concern is if it will have impact on military conduct. Will Israeli Iron Domes be stationed in Abu Dhabi? Will maybe even offensive forces be there? These are fears in Tehran. I think these fears are exaggerated. I think that it will be important for Israel and the normalizing countries, and we will see them doing it, certainly the normalizing countries, saying that the Abraham Accords is not about an offensive initiative against Iran. We are already hearing it very clearly from the UAE, and Morocco, and Sudan to an extent. Bahrain is a different story. And to the extent that it will be viewed as an anti-Iranian vehicle, it will complicate the situation for the UAE, Dubai, Iran businesses, all kinds of things like this. It's not so easy. It's not. In Israel, there is a sense that the Abraham Accords is an alliance with many anti-Iranian forces. On the Arab side of this, the picture is very different. And finally, in Russia, I mean, I didn't mention before, so I'll just say two things. One is Russia has benefited from President Trump's broad strategic direction regarding the Middle East, which was, we want to get out of the Middle East. We want to take our troops out of the Middle East, almost no matter the consequences. And we've seen him repeatedly announcing declare withdrawals and doing them, and then backpedaling and then doing them again from Iraq, from Syria, and it harmed significantly among Middle Easterners the perception of US commitment to the region. And it left a void in which Russia was able to operate quite effectively with very limited investment. What it invested, in fact, in Syria, certainly what it has now in Syria, is very limited, dozens of airplanes. But the kind of influence it got in Syria is dramatic. And it coordinated with Ankara and with Tehran in Syria, something called the Astana Forum, without any US inputs almost. Now Biden, I think, is going to challenge that. I think that with Biden, we are going to see a more consistent commitment to US presence in the Middle East. I don't think that he just wants to send more troops to the Middle East, but I think that there is much more concern about what will happen if the US will fill a void. There is a much deeper commitment to allies, if it is Kurds or others who have fought along with American soldiers. And I think it means that it will be harder for Russia to project power. In the context of the Abraham Accords, what this means for Russia, the big prize Russia is trying to get, given a US withdrawal, is to have Saudi Arabia be in a very strong bilateral relationship with Russia. This is the big prize. If the Abraham Accords draw Saudi Arabia even closer to Israel, and all of this under an American umbrella, with the Americans brokering the agreements, this becomes more difficult. So we are really seeing through the Abraham Accords a clash between two visions for the regional security architecture, a Russian one and an American one. An American one which says some countries are with us, some countries are against us. And Israel and Saudi Arabia are definitely with us, and it depends what the Iranians will do and whether we can stabilize the conflict with them, but not enter full peace with them. Whereas the Russian one is trying to have everyone supposedly be friends with everyone, and especially with Moscow. And the Abraham Accords are making that harder for them, I would say.
Very interesting, and also that that Russia is also kind of profiting from this political vacuum, which is also been left a little bit by the US. So probably Russia also tries to. Would you say that Russia also tries with mangling into the Middle Eastern region, also a little bit to confront Washington? Would you say that this is a fair guess, or it is really mostly about the Saudi Arabia and Russian interests and cooperation?
It's bigger than Saudi Arabia. Russia is, so far, Russia enjoyed the growing void, sometimes only perception of a void because of the Trump administration. I think that now it will be more about taking advantage of conflicts between Middle Eastern countries and the US, conflicts that will create supposedly a void. For example, President Sisi encounters a lot of criticism in Congress and in the White House for human rights conduct. And he will find that certain things the Americans will not be willing to sell to him. He will need to play a game and to show to the Americans, if you don't sell me nuclear reactors, I go to Moscow. And the Russians will be very glad to play this game with him. And I think we will see it in other countries. So it's not that the US is not in the region, but what is the cost, in a way, that it is demanding, including in terms of domestic reforms, from its partners? And what is the alternative cost they have to pay in order to get an equivalent benefit from Moscow? So I think we are seeing we will see more of a competitive dynamic between Russia and the US on such backing especially for Arab countries.
Thank you. When it comes to Washington, I mean, we have been mentioning in the beginning already that especially Washington and Israel used to be the strongest allies, and we saw now what I hear perceived very strongly in Israel is that Biden didn't mention Israel in his first speech on foreign relations, which is quite a signal, or many see it as a signal. In general, also Biden, like even all during his campaign, he was supportive of the Abraham Accords. But as you already also mentioned, Bibi Netanyahu and Trump were very, very good friends, and this is probably also problematic for the Democrats. So, how would you see this scenario of Washington and Israel in the future? And another question, maybe, what is left also of this deal of the century? We all remember the Kushner plan and the deal of the century, the biggest, the Trump deal. And do you think that it is probably also possible that the US didn't mention, or Biden didn't mention Israel because they want to have also part of more secret diplomacy, maybe also when it comes to the Palestinian question within Israel? So many questions,
yes.
please.
I'll do my best. I think that Biden sees himself as a staunch supporter of Israel. I think that he is very different in that from, I mean, for decades. And to the extent, and I think that to the extent that there is a crisis now, it's more it's more about the individual, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the degree to which he is viewed with, is affiliated with President Trump, and how long it took Prime Minister Netanyahu to acknowledge Biden's victory in American elections. All kinds of things that are more personal, I would argue. I don't think that President Biden has a major disagreement with the Israeli right to the extent that he would not call the government or something of the sort. And we have seen very early on that he instructed his senior-most officials to establish direct relationships with their counterparts in Israel. So we've had calls between the heads of the NSCs, the foreign ministers, the defense ministers, and so on. This is one. Two, I think that the priority, in the list of priorities for the Biden administration, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is of a lower priority today. Not so much ethically as much as in terms of how they think, what they think is feasible. And they think that pushing too hard when not much is possible can lead to an escalation. I don't think that they are promoting something secret. I'm sure that they are not planning to promote something based on President Trump's plan. And I think that that plan is, for all intent and purposes, for the next 4 years is, I mean, as a package, it's irrelevant. Maybe some specific ideas there will be drawn upon. There was some creative thinking in it. Some was very harmful, some more open. When you can cherry pick, maybe some of it is fine, is good. I think on settlements, there were interesting ideas and so on. But what I would say is it reflects a shift of focus of the US, again, to other issues. And it's not only Israel that is waiting for a phone call. Almost no Middle Eastern leader has spoken to Biden, except for King Abdullah. And I see also a question about Jordan. I mentioned in the realignments, one thing that was common to all of the 4 camps. All of them have a problem with the incoming administration, big problems with the incoming administrations. I mean, in Israel, it can be settlements and the disagreement with the JCPOA, with the other 3 I mentioned very clearly, I hope. Jordan doesn't have problems with the incoming administration. It's delighted that Biden is in the White House, and Biden is delighted to see it there. And he signaled to everyone in the region that this will be a significant access point for US policies in the region. And Jordan traditionally has been the geopolitical center from an American point of view of the region. Amman was the hub. US firms, the Amman airport is the only place more or less in the region where flights could come from everywhere and go to everywhere and so on. I think that Israel is, this challenges Israel. I'll conclude by saying, I think this challenges Israel to devise ways to agree to disagree with the democratic administration. There is a lot of will in the US to find ways to agree to disagree, but it takes 2 to tango. And this will have costs for both sides, things that they will have to compromise on. In Israel, notably the question of the settlements will have to be curbed in order to allow for that. And it's premature to say. The dialogues haven't begun, but more importantly, we don't know who will win the March elections. And I think that could be really decisive for the relationship.
Since you just mentioned the elections, I would like to touch also, of course, upon the domestic issues. Israel is in a political crisis. It is the 4th election now within 2 years. There is a health crisis, even though Israel has been presented, especially in Central Europe, as like the country with like one of the very good vaccination strategy. especially also within the European Union, which is interesting that we were comparing like 450 million people with a country with 9 million people. But nevertheless, also the numbers of new infected people is very, very high in Israel. So this is maybe you can reflect a little bit like what is going on within Israel. How is the atmosphere now pre-election? I mean, how would you say that? And then, of course, there is also Palestinian elections upcoming, at least. I mean, that is what they have been mentioning. And I think it is more than due that Palestinians also try to unify again. So question about domestic issues, but also about future for Israel-Palestinian relations. Also considering that the annexation plans we heard from Netanyahu before the last elections, when he was saying that he's going to annex the West Bank. I mean, yes. What I hear now, it is suspended within those Abraham Accords, but as you were saying, only suspended. So the domestic question. And then, of course, Gudrun, if you have something to add, you can ask, and we can also go into a discussion after this.
Great. So domestically in Israel, like in many other places in the world, as you said, the conversation begins with COVID-19. And Israel has been very successful in administering the largest number of vaccines very early on. Israel agreed, as perhaps most of you know, to provide data about those of us who have taken the vaccine to the firms, and this didn't create a major controversy. We will see in the long term whether this was wise or not. And at the same time, there is a lot of mismanagement of the COVID-19 crisis, especially in terms of closing the country to flights. And a lot of these variants have entered Israel, creating a totally different challenge. There are also parts in society that have been less cooperative with the state norms, notably some parts of the ultra-Orthodox public, some parts of the Arab publics. And so it's really still very difficult. And if you look at the contagion rates, the level of infection per 100,000 people, Israel is number 1 or 2. Now, according to the New York Times website, now we are number 2 in the world in the number of infections per capita after Montenegro. And that's despite all of the vaccines. So something is not clicking well despite all of this. And Israel is the country in which the number of days under lockdown is number 1 in the world as far as we see in statistics here. So there is something very odd. I'm saying this because much of the vote in the Israeli elections this time will not be about annexation, will not be about peace with Palestinians or lack of, or about, I don't know, the ICC. A lot of it will be about the management of the health crisis. And I think that everyone in Israel would relatively easily agree that the vaccines has been an enormous success of the government of Netanyahu, and the rest has been a significant failure. And it will depend how people will go. I think that Israeli elections are the first time that we are seeing Netanyahu facing up to the major contender coming from the right of Netanyahu rather than to his left. Especially Saar, to some extent Bennett, who declared that he is running for premiership. We also have Yair Lapid on the center, but I'm just saying it's not new. And it's very difficult for Netanyahu to structure the electoral debate in a way that can defend himself both from the right and from the left at the same time, making him more vulnerable. And the elections will be decided primarily on the threshold, the electoral threshold, meaning there are small parties, mostly on the center left, that may not cross the threshold. Any one of them that will not cross it will basically mean an otherwise equally divided society will appear to be different. Finally, on Palestinian elections, I think that we are seeing the factions making more progress between themselves, mostly by postponing the hardest issues for the end, rather than resolving most or all of them. So far, Israel and most of the regional stakeholders have kept quiet, not yet believing that actually there will be elections, and knowing that whatever position they will take can cost them something, including the new American administration. I'll say only that in addition to the internal differences between Fatah and Hamas, especially about which courts exactly will decide in case it is contested, the results, you see disagreements among regional powers over this. There are major concerns in Egypt, in Jordan, some other places that Hamas will win a significant victory, and what will be the knock-on impact on that in other countries. In Egypt, this is very palpable, a visceral fear on the side of President Sisi. And in Israel, I think that to the extent that Hamas runs as an independent list, as opposed to this scenario in which they may run in a joint list that was more considered until recently, and now people are backpedaling from it, I think Israel will probably do what it can to prevent Palestinian elections. Israeli leaders across the board do not want to open a door for a Hamas takeover through the ballot box or otherwise over the West Bank. And we will see how a Biden administration reacts to that. A Biden administration would like to improve, not only to restore its relationship with the PLO, but to make it better. And if Hamas enters the PLO, which will be the case if there is such degree of Palestinian unity like elections, it will be harder for Biden to protect the PLO in American law. It will have designated terror organizations from the perspective of US law inside. So one of the main asks of President Abbas to legalize, in fact, the PLO in the US, not to continue to keep it as a terror organization and only issue a waiver every 6 months, will probably become impossible if Hamas is part of it. Is it okay? Yeah, okay, I'll stop here and you tell me which questions to put.
Yes, before we go to the questions in the chat, yes. Maybe Gudrun, you want to add something and ask something. Please go on.
Thank you very much. And I see there are a lot of questions in the chat. We basically started very broad, zoomed into Israel. What I would be interested in, OFER, is looking a little bit at the relationship Israel-Lebanon. Yeah, we saw the killing of Lokman Slim last week, basically in the south of Lebanon, which is Hezbollah-controlled area. So how is this perceived in Israel? Is there an escalation, or does Israel perceive this as a threat? How could this influence the situation? And seeing that really the government in Lebanon, I mean, was never stable, and it was a very fragile situation over the last decade, but it seems it's getting more and more fragile. So this would be the first question. The second question would be with regard to the Palestinian cause. I mean, if it's true what you just said, that Israel is not interested in these elections to happen, it means basically they will not happen because it's very difficult to organize them without the consent of the Israeli government. So what else actually the Palestinians could do in order to bring their cause again higher on the international agenda? And I'm not thinking of a third intifada. So yes, these are the two questions I have.
Big questions. Great. I'll do my best. The assassination of Mr. Slim is viewed in Israel mostly as an internal matter within the Shia community in Lebanon. Another sign from an Israeli point of view that Hezbollah will not tolerate not so much public critique, but it was when it seems that he was trying to get more data about Hezbollah's money laundering and criminal activities in order to add more designations against Hezbollah. So really, if you're trying to harm Hezbollah's income, basically, you will be harmed. And but there is no impression that Hezbollah is now particularly on the offensive, precisely because of your second point, which is that it's not only that the government in Lebanon is more in a crisis and less stable than ever, the entire state appears to be collapsing. I mean, we could see a failed state. And what does this mean? What does it mean for Hezbollah's future and its control over society and the state apparatus is the big question. What I would say simply is, first, of course, it's horrible. The humanitarian situation and everything in Lebanon is just horrible. we are seeing a country that had a real middle class basically disappearing. I mean, society is changing. It's a very big transformation. But in relative terms, everyone is losing, but Hezbollah is actually is positioning itself still in primacy to others. It still has the weapons, it still has Iranian support, it still has its illegal sources of revenue. It is, in relative terms, of course, it is also still harmed like everyone else in Lebanon, but less so than its competitors. And from an Israeli point of view, this means that further economic sanctions on Lebanon are not, unless you want to see a failed state, are not going to be the thing that weakens Hezbollah. I don't think, now, the only scenario in which Hezbollah will go to war against Israel, which I think is unlikely, is if it felt that it so much needs a scapegoat to deal with all of this situation domestically. And I think that, including the example of, with Mr. Slim, I mean, they know how to deal with domestic opposition in other ways, it seems, at least so far. On the Palestinian elections, and so I don't want to say that it's impossible that there will be Palestinian elections. It will depend what will be the position of the Biden administration. It will depend what list Hamas will field, if these are technocrats or actual Hamas leaders, if it's Mesh'al and Sinwar or professor this and this with a beard from whatever university is not the same. But if it is viewed as a list that Hamas prepared, and most probably it will be viewed like this, I think there is a high chance that Israel will try to prevent elections from happening, and Israel will do its best so that it will be done in a way that it will not look like it was Israel who stopped them. It will look like Abbas did it, it will look like someone else did. Palestinians now have, as they realign, and we haven't spoken about them realigning because we were in this big camps thing, they are, of course, doing all kinds of things to leverage a new momentum, a new context in Washington. They have a strategic choice. Is the realignment based on Palestinian unity or on PLO-US relations, keeping basically a divided Palestinian polity? And there are, so far, Abbas was the one who took the PLO position so far, and most of Palestinians took the unity position. And it's too soon to say what exactly will happen, I suspect, not because of how Palestinians do it only, but also from the US point of view. But I think that there is a question here whether Palestinians really want their issue to become again a #1 issue in the world, or whether they want it to be, how shall I put it, a mid-level issue. Do they think that they can actually get more because there is less attention to it and not everything is immediately hyper-mediatized? If they do, then the Biden administration will be comfortable for them. Biden is not going to just forget about Palestinians in any way. But the intention is to do a more low-key policy, more by the technocrats rather than the president or his envoy and so on. And Palestinians will need to decide whether this is sufficient. Given occupation, this is very difficult to be patient, in effect, and to go for a strategy that is about several years, potentially many. But I think this is the choice. And if they are trying to put it again at the very top of the table, is it realistic? And if so, how to do it? Frankly, I'm not sure that they can. I think that the US is focused on China and COVID-19. And I think that if Palestinians want to be again in the top 5, top 10, I think it's just impossible.
Thank you. Gudrun, do you have another question? Otherwise, I go into the chat. One of the questions in the chat is if you can name like some of the positive effects you can see in this deal of the century.
Yeah. Yes, it's very sensitive. So where do we start? One, I think, as I had mentioned, I think that we do need thinking regarding settlements, which is not exclusively based on evacuation of settlements. We need to think, and it's a conversation that needs to take place between Palestinians and Israelis, and I'm only an Israeli, so I don't feel comfortable doing it alone. But options that were raised by Palestinians and Israelis in the past were about settlements staying under Palestinian rule, The Trump plan talks about Israeli enclaves in a Palestinian state. So there are other options that relate to the status of Jews who will be in the state of Palestine, citizens, residents, and so on. Second, the Trump plan, for the first time, we saw a public American plan that included a map with borders, very problematic borders, if you ask me, but with borders. What does that mean? Is this something to leverage or not? Others would say this is an opportunity to present a different kind of map. And so if you ask me, not now, I think this will be a mistake, but in the future, maybe. I think that they looked at land swaps in very creative ways, sometimes overly creative, but I think it's interesting. I think there were, I wrote also a lot of criticism about the Trump plan. I think that it failed in, primarily it's reduced Palestinians to, as if they focus only on material issues, as if they don't have a national identity. There was no parity, not parity of esteem, not parity in distribution of resources. I think it was anchored mostly in a Jewish worldview of justice rather than finding a space between two peoples. There were a lot of problems. But if you go through it, also in the economic section, there were some promising things. I don't think, you know, when you do 140 pages or whatever it was, it can't all be bad.
Thank you very much. I think it's important always also to mention like how complex the whole situation is within Israel and Palestine when it comes to identity, when it comes to culture, history, etc. Another question is, today we are hearing about hybrid battles and asymmetric warfare in the Persian Gulf, and the Iranians in this model of warfare have developed their capabilities by developing point-to-point missiles and multi-role offensive, reconnaissance and disruptive drones. Also, there is accumulated energy in Arab and Muslim countries against Israel. So the question is, do you think that any possible attack on Iran will lead to a comprehensive attack on Israel?
Very grim scenarios. Look, we saw Iran, arguably, I don't know it, we don't have hard evidence, but the Saudis believe we saw Iran firing such advanced missiles on Aramco, and yes, these technologies exist, and Iran's technologies are by far more advanced than what we see across the region, in at least among Israel's enemies. You can't rule out a full-out war. I think that if Israel will try to militarily destroy the Iranian nuclear program, all Israelis anticipate that Iran will respond forcefully and will use all of these strategies. As we all know, Israel has also defensive technologies that are very advanced, and the same missile that managed to get into Saudi might not have succeeded to get into Israel, and so on. So there is an arms race. I think that I'm personally much more interested in how to make such scenarios less likely. So I don't, but it's possible, yes.
I like the approach. Another question is, why does Israel not vaccine West Bank people?
Yes, it's a good question. Look, there is a decision to be taken, primarily by Palestinians, by the PA. I mean, I'll just say that the PA can't at the same time say that it should be responsible for the territories that it is governing and does not want, therefore, Israeli military incursions into it, and it has to be full responsibility of Ramallah. And at the same time, ask Israel to vaccinate their own population. So we just need to know on what planet we are. If we are all in, the current reality is such that Israel has direct responsibility for everything there. It goes with additional things. My view personally is that Israel should find ways to help Palestinians purchase such vaccines. The two populations are intertwined. There is a common interest here. Contagion will not be able to end otherwise, and everything else. And ethically, of course, it's very important. But currently, the reason that Israel is not doing it is because of the two approaches I've mentioned. Israel does not say that the population under PA rule is under Israeli direct responsibility. Israel says that according to the Oslo Agreement, and you can read the agreement otherwise, of course, including Israeli legal experts who read it otherwise, this is the responsibility of the PA.
Thank you very much. When I look at the time, I'm quite happy. It's 5 o'clock, so we set for an hour, and I don't see any additional question. I think the first.
I see questions in something called Q&A.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, but I went through them.
Not in the chat, in Q&A.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
I don't know how that managed, because I can't write in them, but...
Yeah. Oh, no. Come on. No, okay, sorry. Okay, there's a question. Would you say that the Kushner plan is dead, or has it created a new situation which Biden cannot ignore, as for settlements and abandonment of two-state solution?
Okay. Yeah, I don't think the plan is dead forever. I said that as a package, it is not relevant in the next 4 years. First, it has become a significant frame of reference for Israelis. Perhaps only Israelis and Republicans, but certainly Israelis and Republicans, when they think now of the conflict, they think about it and will think about it in relation to this plan. So from that point of view, you can't just erase it from the table, no matter how much you like it or dislike it and so on. Second, Kushner himself promoted the Abraham Accords as an alternative to Israeli unilateral action trying to supposedly implement this plan through annexation. And I think that to the extent that we talk about the Kushner plan as an annexation plan, the normalization agreements make that harder. It will be harder to annex without losing some or all of this normalization for Israel. And it created an interesting attachment of the Israeli right to a set of relationships, diplomatic relationships. I think that it has become another document on the table. I think that as time goes by, it will lose support probably among Israelis also in terms of how feasible it appears. But it can also regain relevance especially with the Republican president who will view himself as closer to the Trump camp within that party. And I think more importantly than all of this, one basic thing the Kushner plan did, and this is why it's viewed rightly so as very one-sided, it took many of the positions of Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Israeli right and said these positions should be the way to resolve the conflict. For the most part, it did not invent new positions. What it did was it put them on the table in a systematic fashion. And also before them, there was a need to deal with people who believe that this is the way to deal with the conflict. So that also is not going to disappear. Even if the plan disappears, the people who believe in these values and these positions are still very much there, and their support is most probably necessary to resolve the conflict.
Thank you. There's another question. I think we touched a little bit upon it from Wilfried Graf. Yes. About the Palestinian side and elections and intra-Palestinian reconciliation. So maybe we touched upon it. Maybe if you want to add something.
No, I think we touched about it. I don't want to, yes. I think he asked it before we spoke.
Before, yes, even now. Yes. And another very important question also from Wilfried Graf is about strategic realignment of the European Union. So how could a new European Middle East policy look like?
Yeah, he has very difficult questions, Wilfried. This is, so for the Middle East, Europe has been, of course, very concerned with, unlike the US, which has an ocean separating it from the Middle East, Europe doesn't have that, for better and worse. So let's just say doesn't have that luxury for worse. And the failed states, the risk of failed states is much more acute, I would say, from a European point of view. We mentioned Lebanon. The risk of Egypt becoming a failed state, of course, is increasingly significant and much more dramatic given over 100 million Egyptians and everything we know. I think that the most fundamental thing that the Middle East needs is deeper than everything we've discussed in the last hour. It is about consolidating functioning states in the region. And whether they bicker among themselves and so on is dramatic, but many of the wars have happened because the states were not functioning, not because of an Israel-Iran conflict or Saudi-Turkish competition and so on. And I would say that the EU has also tried to be the responsible adult on many issues like this, which are more about infrastructure and climate and things that appear to be less about high politics. What I think is still missing is how to elicit cooperation also among adversaries in the region regarding these common challenges. And Biden wants to act in a multilateral manner. Biden is looking especially for European partners globally and certainly in the Middle East. We need to be very sober about what multilateralism can produce, don't get me wrong, but I think now is the time to think about thematic multilateral engagements and how they can sometimes sidestep, politicize the context and nevertheless make progress. I would say that the major challenge for the EU in doing this is how not to be opposed, because it will, in the past, when the EU promoted these things, too often it seemed to promote in tandem also a liberalization of societies and sometimes their secularization. And there is a question that is very difficult from an ethical point of view. If you want Egypt not to be a failed state, and Sisi says, I'm not going to do the kind of democratic reform you're talking about because I will no longer be the head of the state and I want to remain. And Assad tells the same thing and so on. How do you deal with this basic tension? And I think the Middle East is in a very vulnerable place because of the last 10 years, not because of Trump or Biden or Obama or whatever it is after the Arab uprisings. So I think that one has to go to basics. And I think that I would suggest to find ways not to abandon liberal values, but to see how one can promote liberal values in a way that coheres with worldviews and systems of governance that are not democratic and not liberal. And this is a major challenge. I don't know that the EU knows how to do this, but I hope it will find out how to do it.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that also the IIP will have discussions on these topics in the future as well. There is another question, which is more about like, why doesn't Israel deliberately itself try to solve the long-term conflicts with the Arabs in order to remove any pretext to the others?
So this is linked to the first question about also normalization with Israel and Jordan. First, yes, I think it depends what is a long-time conflict. On the Palestinian question specifically, a long-time conflict of a century, Israel, it's not that it doesn't want to, I would say most Israelis think it's impossible to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that most Israelis believe that the majority of Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership rejects Israel as a place which could maintain Jewish national self-determination. And I think that this has reasons that are relating to how Israeli leaders perceive and misperceive Palestinian conduct, but also to how Palestinian leaders have failed to put forward a plan that is compelling for Israelis. I think that also the Arab Peace Initiative, I see no prospects of the majority of Israelis accepting a plan that makes such strict demands on the historic areas in Jerusalem, to which Jews, like Palestinians, are deeply committed, that is vague on refugees, and is extremely specific on borders in ways that Israelis, you can't, I don't think that this is going to happen. I think that we need a different approach that is not what I would suggest is solutionism, looking first at the end point and agreeing on that and then reverse engineering. Because the parties are unable to agree on one solution, regrettably. And we need to devise strategies that are more dynamic and gradual, whether we like it or not. I think this is what one is left with. Would have been great to solve everything from the beginning. I think that normalization with Egypt and Jordan is much, much more complicated than with the UAE or any of the distant societies. Israel was at war with Jordan, was at war with Egypt. These societies know this in a very intimate manner because of losses in their families. These societies are much closer to Palestinians, certainly Jordanian society with a higher rate of Palestinians. And frankly, there is more anti-Semitism in these societies than in some other Arab societies. So whereas I think it will be great to advance stronger relationships, not only normalization, but there has been disregard in Israel of Jordanian interests for a few years, and this should change, for example. I think that with the Biden administration, I hope that the administration will put more of an emphasis on Israel's relations with Jordan and Egypt in a way that takes into account Palestinian needs. I think that the Abraham Accords did well for Israeli relations with the normalizing Arab countries, but it came at the expense often of Israel's relations with Jordan and Egypt, and at the expense of Egyptian and Jordanian interests. Jordan lost some of its role as a regional hub because of the shift of the center of the region supposedly to the Gulf. And Egypt is losing also its role. We are seeing that the UAE and Israel are basically creating ways to export commodities, oil, from the Gulf to the Mediterranean through a land bridge from Eilat to Ashdod, to Ashkelon, basically meaning that Egypt will lose a major source of revenue, big part of the revenues of the Suez Canal, at a time in which they have no revenues really from tourism like they had in the past, and where remittances from Egyptians abroad have dropped dramatically. And we are talking about a time in which people are seriously talking about state collapse in Egypt. So really the Abraham Accords need to figure out into their deeper logic how not to endanger Egypt and Jordan, not to endanger the relationships with Israel. I think this is something that is an omission on the side of the Abraham Accords.
Very interesting point. There is now really the last question I see here in the queue. Okay, Gudrun, I pose the question first, and then you can still, of course, ask an additional question. So the question is, what is the Biden approach on the Century deal? And I also have a question related on Facebook, which asks if we shall give Trump's administration some credit for the peace deals.
Yes. So I'm not sure what it means, what's the Biden's approach on the deal of the century, on the Trump plan. I had mentioned, I think that, does it mean, to the extent that it refers to the Kushner plan, they view it as an entirely unrealistic plan in terms of Palestinian consent to it. And they don't see any way that a Palestinian leader would give up on the historic areas of Jerusalem and on refugee rights and on and the whole list. On Facebook, whoever asked it, I fully agree. I think that I fully agree, but with a caveat, meaning, yes, I think that the question of credit is interesting. Also, the Obama administration tried to promote normalization agreements between Israel and the Arab countries, including some of the ones that have reached it, and failed, tried and failed. They have failed for two reasons in comparison to Trump, I would say. One is they tried to weave in the Palestinians, and Trump's people decided that that's not important. And we can all say whether that was good or not, it depends on our values, on our whatever. And two, before 2016, still these Arab countries were in a different situation than where they were in 2019, 2020 for two main reasons. One is that the conflicts that across the Arab world have worsened, and the priority given to the Palestinian issue has decreased in these countries. And if Trump would have tried in 2016 or 2015, I doubt he would have succeeded, therefore. And second, the reason that it became possible was that the Trump administration gave, at least it seemed, a green light to annexation. And the UAE was able to say, I'm normalizing with Israel to help Palestinians in order to get rid of annexation. The Trump administration, I don't know, therefore, if it is to their credit, were trying to promote two contradictory policies, two mutually exclusive policies, Israeli annexation of 30% of the West Bank and Israeli normalization with Arab countries. And one of them helped the other, As far as I know, by talking to senior US officials, Israeli officials, this was inadvertent. It wasn't that the US said, we will put forward the threat of annexation so that everyone will do normalization. This is why I wouldn't really call it credit as much as a successful outcome during the Trump years, which definitely it was. And this is why definitely it was compared to Democrats. Again, I tell you, those who think that these agreements should not be promoted while disregarding Palestinian needs, I'm one of them. No, this is not to their credit. This is I think that this can cause also harm. And I think there could have been ways to do it, not necessarily with the Palestinian leadership saying yes or no, but to do it in a way that does not come at the expense of a possibility to truly resolve or to move towards resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think the Trump administration did all kinds of worthy things, very significant things. There were successes. I personally think that what they did with the Taliban, for example, doing a non-recognition agreement, had all kinds of problems. I won't get into it now, but the notion that you can do an agreement even with the Taliban if you do it in a specific way is something I think that future US policies will build on and successfully. So I don't think at all that it was only a set of failures. And again, I think that the way in which they referred directly to Abrahamic traditions is something future US and European administrations should build on. I think that there were significant, the way that the Trump administration managed to get US evangelicals to support Israeli peace with Arab countries rather than annexation of territory, this is very successful. The way that they managed to get at least support from the Israeli right to a Palestinian state in name, not of course fully materially. Also not negligible. So I don't think that there is a zero track record from the perspective of those who want to see resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, almost no matter what it will be. But I think they've also caused a lot of harm, both to US interests and from my perspective to Israeli interests and to the challenges of advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace. We are talking today about Trump. I have a long list of complaints about the Obama administration, Clinton administration. We can do that another time maybe.
Thank you very much. Gudrun, you also wanted to ask something or add something.
Yes, I know we are over time, but the last probably very naive question to you, OFER. Coming back to the JCPOA, what would Israel need in order to be supportive of reactivating or renegotiating the JCPOA? Or is there no chance at all?
Yeah, that's the $64 million question, or whatever it's called. So there is no Israel in the singular, and the identity of the Prime Minister after March will change my reply. Prime Minister Netanyahu, if he is re-elected, will be very hard to convince to join to support the JCPOA and returning to compliance with it. He has a lot of sunk costs in opposing it, personal, electoral, policy-wise, and I think that the main thing I would suggest then, and it will be more in terms of limiting Israeli criticism rather than winning Israeli support, is about a set of US-Israeli understandings, which might be quiet rather than public, about what the US would do if Iran violates the agreement, to put it very simply. And these could go for lengthy duration, because the main challenge from the Prime Minister's point of view is the sunset clauses, is the duration of the JCPOA. And this is the only way to limit some of the perceived harm from his point of view. If the government is led by another leader, Saar, Lapid, Bennett, whatever it is, I think there will be room for broader understandings, at least for trying broader understandings, not only on the nuclear file, but also with respect to the long-range missiles and to Iran's regional policies. which means that there will have to be a way to establish do's and don'ts for everyone in the Middle East, rather than everyone saying all of it is mine. So to take the example of Syria, saying there cannot be a single Iranian in Syria or no Israeli, any interest in Syria is legitimate, is one way of going about it. And there are different ways of going about it. And someone needs to help the parties who are, of course, enemies to figure this out. And I think that after June, we will see also how the Iranian political landscape is shaping. Not so much, it will still be Khamenei as the leader, but we will basically see whether the IRGC's power in policymaking increases, and what does that mean. So when I say that it's about the Israeli leader, it's not only, of course, about Israeli politics, but I would say that one more thing that is very important that is usually missed. If you try to ask yourself the most basic question about why Iranians are Israel's enemies, what's going on? And Iran and Israel were on good terms until '79. It's not like something in the map. What is it? And I would say that one significant element is related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And to the extent that there will be progress on the Israeli-Palestinian file, it could be done in ways that reduce Iranian motivations, Iranian hateful motivations towards Israel. This is very much pie in the sky, distant, difficult, because I just told you half an hour ago that a full Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, to my judgment, is not possible in the next 4 years. But I think we need to look at this interrelationship between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli-Iranian conflict more seriously, rather than pretend that it doesn't exist. And it requires, of course, constructive approaches also from Tehran, including on this issue. Tehran's approach towards Israel has been, even to the extent that it is related to Israeli-Palestinian differences, has been very much about Israel's basic legitimacy rather than about Israeli policies. And to the extent that Iran continues with that, obviously, we will not see a lot of progress between Israel and Iran.
Thank you very much. And let me also take up for self-advertisement, because also someone in the chat was asking if we cannot organize something on USA and Iran nuclear deal. And let me just tell you that I'm also posting it in the chat that we are planning on 15th of March, exactly in our series. It's our third event on USA back to multilateralism, exactly on the Iran nuclear deal and also on a nuclear-free weapon-free zone for the Middle East. So for all people interested, this is planned, and I'm happy that this seems to be also of interest. I would say we're now a little bit over time, but it was very interesting for me again. It's so many different topics, from the Abraham Accords, from the regional context, into what is going on domestically. Then domestically, it's also very complicated. So I really think it was, for me, it was very interesting. I learned a lot. So thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much to our cooperation partners. GUDRUN is here from Schleining, from the Austrian Study Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution, and Wilfried Graf from the Herbert K. Kerman Institute, who was also here. So thank you very much for joining. It was a pleasure seeing you again. I really hope that we can meet again either in Jerusalem or here in Vienna pretty soon. In the meantime, I would say have a nice evening, and yes, enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.